Good morning.
Good morning.
I've preached at other churches before, but it's nice to be preaching and looking out and seeing my church family this morning. Some of you know that in my professional life, I lead the marketing team at Everence Financial, which is headquartered right here in Goshen. And over the course of the past 14 months, I've had 3 different offices. I started out in one that was at the heart of the Everence marketing team's space, with a big window and good natural light. I'd been in that office for a handful of years, and so it had become pretty comfortable. Then I packed up my stuff and moved 2 doors down to a different office so that 2 of our new marketing directors could have offices side by side so that they could better collaborate with each other and meet one-on-one with their staff. It didn't hurt that this new office space had even more windows and even more natural light. But then just 4 months later, I packed up my books and my computer and my office supplies and my furniture, and I moved again. This time to an office located across the entire building. I had just been named one of the newest members of the Everence senior leadership team, and my new office is located in our company's executive suite, which is where my boss had asked me to move to. Considering that my new office now faces a brick wall and a side door, I didn't make this move because it was comfortable. In fact, this last move has been a little bit of an adjustment. In my nearly 13 years at Everence, this is the first time that I've sat in a space that is so far removed from the marketing team, a group of people with whom I work, collaborate, and lead, a group of people that I care deeply about. There are times that I really miss being in physical proximity to them. My new space doesn't quite yet feel as familiar and comfortable. Turn on the news, and some might say that the world we live in doesn't feel very comfortable or secure. We're bombarded with stories of people crying out, asking for redemption and justice. 50 years after Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination, African Americans are still raising their voices against the killing of Black mothers' sons. Teachers are walking off of their jobs, demanding pay raises and improved funding for schools. Women are coming out of the shadows, telling their stories of harassment and assault as part of the Me Too movement. Children are taking to the streets, literally marching for their lives in the midst of increased gun violence. And that's just what's happening here in the U.S. The threat of nuclear war from North Korea has felt palpable over the past year or so, especially to those within geographical proximity to that nation. Over 500,000 Rohingya people have fled military and political persecution in Myanmar. Boko Haram continues to violently terrorize millions of people, including members of the Church of the Brethren of Nigeria. And speaking of the church, it's not immune either. The Roman Catholic Church continues to deal with fallout from their child sex abuse scandals. Denominations, including the Church of the Brethren and Mennonite Church USA, are figuratively and literally splitting apart due to conflicting viewpoints on homosexuality. And for centuries and still today, the church has struggled with and sometimes been complicit in behaviors, beliefs, and attitudes around supremacy, racism, and suppression that separate Christians not only from each other, but also from God. In a recent reflection in Sojourners magazine, Reverend Dr. Will Gaffney, an Episcopal priest and associate professor of Hebrew Bible at Bright Divinity School, wrote, and I quote, "The whole Christian year stretches toward this moment when we reach back to acclaim the power of God over death manifest in the resurrected life of Jesus. The passion and pageantry of the days from Palm Sunday to Easter Sunday enable believers to mystically live in the ancient moments we commemorate. At the same time, we are very much present in a world that is anything but resurrected. It is crucified and crucifying, end quote. All around us, we see the broken places in our world. We see the cracks in our humanity. We hear the cries of lamentation, and we feel the grief and sorrow in our hearts. It's difficult when life doesn't feel comfortable. As humans, we're hardwired for structure and stability, although I will admit some people crave that structure and stability more than others. But when things feel upended or unfamiliar, we start to feel disoriented, uncertain, maybe scared, maybe even burdened. Christ's ministry wasn't always comfortable either, though. In fact, so much of what Jesus said and did made people really uncomfortable. He publicly confronted and corrected the false teachings of the scribes and Pharisees and Sadducees. He even called people names, like referring to the Pharisees as offspring of serpents, false teachers as wolves, and non-believing Gentiles as dogs. He threw furniture around in the temple to call out the greed and corruption of the money changers. You see, when we get too comfortable, God nudges us to get uncomfortable. When we crave structure and stability, He pushes us to lean into the chaos and disorganization. When we want things to take their supposed natural course, He calls us to remove the dead branches that are in the way. Some of you know that from 2007 to 2015, I was a member of the Board of Directors for On Earth Peace, which is the peace and justice agency of the Church of the Brethren. And from 2008 to 2013, I served as their board chairperson. And during that time, the On Earth Peace board and staff began working to address issues of racism within and outside of the organization. Now, I know that on the surface, it might seem odd that an organization dedicated to peace and justice would need to address racism within its own walls. But I'm not necessarily talking about racist individuals. The On Earth Peace board and staff recognize that as bias and race prejudice have developed in our society over centuries, they've become structured into our institutions and systems, including the church. And we decided that as an agency dedicated to social justice, we needed to examine how systemic racism might be creating unseen barriers within our own foundation in order to more effectively and authentically help other congregations and communities do the same. We partnered with an organization called Crossroads Anti-Racism Organizing and Training, based out of the Chicago area. And they worked with us to identify our cultural shaping as individuals and an institution, to understand the power dynamics in society that impact us, and to develop skills that would help interrupt old patterns and inequitable practices that might exclude some people from participating in the life and work of On Earth Peace. By the time I stepped down from the board, we had conducted a number of internal training events and decided to analyze and audit our policies and procedures that might contribute to unbalanced power and privilege. Additionally, we decided to establish an anti-racism transformation team that would be charged with creating a strategy for dismantling oppressive systems inside the organization. Their work is ongoing and will continue for generations, long after I stepped off of the board. Our friends at Crossroads reminded us that it's taken centuries for systems of oppression to grow and become foundational in our society, so we can't expect to dismantle them overnight. And while daunting, that generation-long time frame didn't discourage the board and staff of On Earth Peace, because they felt God nudging them into the uncomfortable space. The board and staff of On Earth Peace knew that they had to remove the dead branches within their system in order for spiritual growth to take place. The image of the vine in today's reading from John chapter 15 is a vivid description of our interrelationship as individuals and as a community. According to Brian Stoffergen, a Lutheran pastor in Yuma, Arizona, in a vine, branches are almost completely indistinguishable from another. It's impossible to determine where one branch stops and another branch starts. They all run together as they grow out of the central vine. Sure, there are individual branches, but all of the branches eventually encircle one another completely. Thus, says Brian, the fruitfulness of each individual branch depends on the relationship to the vine. The sheer magnitude of our personal, local, and global struggles we face each and every day can feel inextricably overwhelming. It can be easy to persuade ourselves that there's nothing more we can do to help. We wish that we could either stay put or jump ahead to the parts that are simple, easy, comfortable, without doing any of the unpleasant scut work. It can be tempting to think that solving these problems is actually somebody else's responsibility. I'd like to share another story with you, though. This one was written by a professional acquaintance of mine named Wally Croker. Wally, who hails from Canada, retired last year after a long stint serving as director of publications for MEDA, a Mennonite-related international economic development organization. In 1998, Herald Press published a book comprised of some of Wally's writings titled God's Week Has 7 Days, Monday Musings for Marketplace Christians. It's a wonderful little book filled with quick short stories and Wally's infectious sense of humor. This particular short story, which I believe he wrote during the month of June in who knows what year, jumped out at me as I was preparing for today's message. Some of you folks down south, now remember Wally's from Canada, so he's talking about us when he says folks down south. Some of you folks down south are harvesting, while here, north of the 49th parallel, we're still busy cultivating. Nevertheless, the anticipation of harvest, if not its timing, is the same everywhere. Harvest feels good. It has its own energy, smell, and mystique. It marks the end of a process that began long before. As a boy, I spent many long days, hoe in hand, clawing weeds in the onion fields, acre after acre of sour-smelling onions. Finish one field and another's waiting. Will those onions ever reach maturity? Does the hour hand ever move? Yet grow they did. After weeks and weeks of hoeing, coddling, cultivating, spraying, and irrigating, the onions grew bigger than baseballs. Marvelous little things happened at harvest time. Work became more fun. The onions still reeked worse than before. Cutting the tops released a flow of juice that infected hands and clothes. Noses burned and eyes dripped. We worked harder and longer than ever, but it didn't matter. It wasn't drudgery because it was harvest time. The fruits of our labors were being plucked from the soil. The result of our work was there before us, to see, to weigh, to sell. As the bins filled, our sense of worth and joy welled up within us. The product even looked different during that festival time of year. Behold the onion! No longer a fragile sprout to be sheltered and cajoled, but now a firm and robust bulb ready to grace hamburger or stew. The late Stan Mooneyham, longtime crusader for the hungry and dispossessed, once described harvesting as a dramatic and fulfilling part of life's cycle. You see what you get and you get what you see, he wrote. In the earlier stages, there is nothing, or at least very little. In fact, when you plant, you cover up even what you started with. However, those early stages are vital. Without drudgery of preparing the soil, planting the seed, and tending it to maturity, there would be no fulfilling harvest. No stage can be left out. It's tempting to become preoccupied with harvest. In the church, at least, some are inclined to jump from sowing to the reaping, to exalt the evangelist who closes the deal. This can lead to a skewed ranking that overlooks unsung second-string workers in ministries. Without them, no harvest would be possible in the first place. Hoeing isn't always exciting, nor is the grueling task of preparing new ground. Tearing out stumps, leveling chuck holes, clearing rocks. Bringing in the crop is more fun. Maybe that's why some like to support ministries that can show a full bin now, forgetting somewhere along the way somebody had to buy the fuel to plant and cultivate. I know the Lord told us to pray for workers to be thrust into the harvest, Mooneyham wrote, but I don't think he'd mind if we broadened it to include some who will cultivate, plant, and hoe. The Lord of the joyful harvest is also Lord of the foot slogging and the hoeing. In business and in the church, we can't all harvest. Somebody has to hoe. Sometimes, almost all the time in my opinion, God's restorative love is present not just in the comfortable spaces we love to be in, but also in the challenging, uncomfortable spaces we live and work in. The commandment to love one another as I have loved you is given in the context of growth and community. And God wants us to work together to receive his restorative love. He wants us to share it, to nurture it, and to cultivate it. And when we do the foot-slogging work to clear away the dead branches, when we lean into the discomfort and the unfamiliar, God shows us his restorative love. Love that enables us to bear fruit that will last. So as we go out into our lives in the world this week, I invite you to think about the dead branches that need to be cleared away in your lives and your community so that spiritual growth can take place. I invite you to consider how you are continuing Christ's work of bringing life, love, and hope to those around you. In the midst of discomfort and pain, in the midst of the uncomfortable, how might you bear witness to the transforming power of God's restorative love? Amen.